My 3 children came to my house after I left the hospital, but they didn't bring flowers. They brought a schedule dividing me between their homes, a realtor's estimate for my house, and one cruel instruction. Sundays, I was on my own. "We can't keep you full-time," my son Mark said, laying a printed paper on my coffee table. "Sundays, you're on your own." My daughter Rachel nodded, not even looking me in the eye. "Just follow the schedule, Mom. 2 days at Mark's place, 2 days with me, 2 with David. Sundays, you can go to church, visit friends, or sit in a diner. We just can't do 7 days." I sat on my sofa, still weak from the high blood pressure spike that had put me in the hospital 2 days ago. I had spent 34 years in this modest 3-bedroom home in Indiana, raising them alone after my husband passed. When I saw all 3 of their cars parked outside today, my heart had swelled. I thought they were here because they loved me. Instead, they brought a real estate agent's estimate and a calendar. "If we sell this house, the proceeds split 4 ways will pay off my credit cards." "David," my youngest muttered, tapping his foot. "Plus, looking after a house this size is too much for you anyway." I looked down at the paper. It was divided into color-coded blocks. Monday and Tuesday, Mark. Wednesday and Thursday, Rachel. Friday and Saturday, David. Sunday, blank. They treated me like a shift duty, a piece of heavy luggage to be passed around so no one carried the full weight. Slowly, I picked up the paper. My hands trembled not from weakness, but from a cold, sharp clarity. I tore it right down the middle, then tore it again. "No one gets to schedule my life for me." I said, my voice steady and quiet. Mark sighed loudly. "Mom, don't be dramatic. You fainted. You can't live alone anymore." "I fainted because I was exhausted," I replied, staring at the 3 adults I had bled myself dry to raise. "And I am certainly not selling my home to clear your debts." "You're being completely unreasonable, Mom," Rachel said, crossing her arms. "Do you know how much effort it took us to coordinate our work calendars for this?" I looked at Rachel. For years, I had quietly paid her overdue utility bills and bought groceries for her kids when her husband was between jobs. I had never asked for repayment. I thought that was what mothers did. "I didn't ask you to coordinate anything," I said softly, gathering the torn scraps of paper from the table. "I thought you came here today because you were worried about my health." "We are worried," Mark snapped. "That's why we're offering our spare rooms, but we all have full-time jobs and families. We can't turn our lives upside down. Selling this house gives everyone a clean slate." "A clean slate for you," I corrected him. "Where do I fit into this clean slate, moving my clothes in garbage bags every 48 hours? Sleeping on sofa beds?" David looked away, rubbing the back of his neck. "It's better than finding you collapsed on the floor alone, Mom." His words hit a raw nerve because he wasn't entirely wrong. I had been terrified when the room started spinning 3 days ago. Lying on the hallway carpet, reaching for my phone, I had felt the cold hand of mortality. I knew I couldn't pretend everything was fine anymore, but being treated as a burden wasn't the answer either. "I made mistakes raising you 3, I said, quietly looking at their tense faces. "I gave you everything you asked for, even when I had nothing left for myself. I taught you how to take, but I clearly forgot to teach you how to care." "Don't guilt trip us," Mark said coldly. "If you refuse our help, you're on your own. Don't call us the next time your blood pressure spikes." They walked out, slamming the front door behind them. The silence in the house after they left was deafening. I sat at the kitchen table with a cold cup of tea, staring at the empty chairs. My first instinct was anger, but as the hours crept by, a heavier emotion settled in my chest: regret. I couldn't blame my children entirely. I had created this dynamic. When Mark wanted money for his first failed business venture, I took out a second mortgage. When Rachel needed a new car, I emptied my small savings account. When David asked for cash to pay off his gambling debts 5 years ago, I gave him my late husband's emergency fund. I had raised them to believe my purpose in life was to solve their financial problems and absorb their stress. I had never set boundaries. I had mistaken self-sacrifice for good parenting. Now, in their eyes, I wasn't a mother with dignity. I was merely a physical asset sitting on a valuable piece of property waiting to be liquidated. I walked to the hallway mirror. The woman looking back at me looked tired. Her gray hair untamed, her shoulders slouched. But beneath the exhaustion, there was still a spark of the independent young woman who had worked 30 years as a county clerk. I hadn't lost my mind. I hadn't lost my willpower. I had only lost my voice because I was too afraid of disappointing my kids. No more, I whispered to the reflection. I went to my desk, opened my address book, and dialed a number I hadn't called in years. It was just time to talk to Thomas, my late husband's old friend, and an attorney who handled elder law. I didn't want revenge. I didn't want to hurt my children. But I needed to protect what little peace I had left. Thomas sat across from me at his office the next morning, listening patiently as I explained everything. He didn't look surprised. He had seen this story play out 100 times in his 40 years of practice. "Grace," Thomas said, setting down his pen. "First, let's look at the facts. Is your name the sole name on the deed to your house?" "Yes," I replied. "When Henry passed, everything transferred to me. It's fully paid off." "And do you have any outstanding debts?" "None. My pension and modest Social Security cover my utilities, groceries, and property taxes, with a little left over." "I'm not rich, Thomas, but I don't owe anyone a dime." Thomas nodded slowly. "Then your children have zero legal right to force a sale, nor can they dictate where you live. However, your health concern is real. If another emergency happens and you are incapacitated, they could petition the court for guardianship if you don't have proper advance directives in place." A chill ran down my spine. "What does that mean?" "It means if you don't choose who makes decisions for you, a judge might choose them," Thomas explained gently. "You need to update your living will, appoint a healthcare proxy you trust, and set up a clear power of attorney." "I don't want to give power of attorney to any of my children," I said firmly. "Not after yesterday." "You don't have to," Thomas said. "You can name an independent professional fiduciary or a trusted friend. You can also set up a revocable trust for your house, ensuring that upon your death, it gets handled exactly how you want, not fought over like scraps." For the first time in weeks, I felt a weight lifting off my chest. I wasn't helpless. The system had tools to protect people like me as long as I was brave enough to use them. 3 days later, Rachel showed up at my door unannounced. She didn't bring flowers or food. She brought a man in a navy suit carrying a clipboard. "Mom, this is Mr. Gable," Rachel said, pushing past me into the living room. "He's from an independent senior living assessment agency. He's just here to evaluate your living conditions." My blood boiled, but I kept my composure. "Rachel, I didn't request an evaluation." "We did," Rachel said, her tone sharp. "Mark, David, and I agreed. Since you refused our rotation schedule, we need an official assessment of whether you can safely maintain a household alone. If the report says you can't, we'll take it to a probate judge." The man in the suit looked uncomfortable. "Ma'am, I was told this was a voluntary assessment requested by the family." "It is not voluntary," I said, stepping forward and opening the front door wide. "Mr. Gable, I respect your profession, but I am in full possession of my faculties, and you are trespassing on my private property. Please leave." The assessor quickly apologized, gathered his papers, and walked out without another word. Rachel turned on me. Her face flushed with anger. "Are you insane? We're trying to help you. You're 72, Mom. You collapsed." "I collapsed from exhaustion, Rachel, partly because I spent the week before that babysitting your kids while you went on vacation," I shouted, finally letting my anger out. "I have loved you unconditionally, but I will not be ambushed in my own living room." "You're turning into a bitter old woman," Rachel spat out. "If you fall again, don't expect us to drop everything and run to the hospital." "I won't," I said, my voice dropping back to a quiet, firm tone, "because I've already made other arrangements." The next week, I made 2 major changes in my life. First, I visited the local community center. I signed up for a weekly medical check-in service operated by a local nursing network. For $40 a month, a registered nurse stopped by every Tuesday to check my vitals and review my medication. I also got a wearable medical alert button that would call an ambulance immediately if I fell. Second, I answered an advertisement placed by a woman named Clara. Clara was a 58-year-old retired school librarian whose husband had passed away 2 years ago. She was looking for a quiet, affordable room to rent. We met at a coffee shop downtown. Clara was soft-spoken, kind, and fiercely independent. She loved gardening and reading just like me. I don't need a nurse, and I don't need a manager, I told her honestly over tea. I just want someone reliable living in the spare bedroom, someone who notices if I don't come down for breakfast, and someone I can share a meal with. Clara smiled warmly. Grace, I don't need a mother, and I certainly don't want to intrude on your life. I just want a peaceful place to call home where I can contribute to the rent and help keep the place alive. We signed a simple formal lease agreement drawn up by Thomas. Clara moved in the following Saturday. The house, which had felt cold and hauntingly empty since my hospital stay, suddenly filled with the smell of fresh coffee and the gentle hum of quiet conversation. Having Clara around didn't mean I was dependent. It meant I was smart enough not to isolate myself out of pride. I was rebuilding my life on my own terms, piece by piece. Word traveled fast. When Mark found out I had rented the spare bedroom to a tenant, he was furious. He drove over on a Sunday afternoon, slamming his car door so hard the sound echoed down the street. He marched up the porch steps and confronted me as I was watering the hydrangeas. "Are you out of your mind?" Mark yelled, ignoring Clara, who was reading quietly on the porch swing. "You put a stranger in our childhood home without asking us." I set the watering can down calmly. "Mark, this is my home. I don't need your permission to take in a tenant." "She's a stranger," he shouted, pointing at Clara. "How do you know she isn't trying to scam you out of the house?" "You're vulnerable, Mom." "I am not vulnerable, Mark," I said, looking him dead in the eye. "Clara pays rent, which covers my property taxes. She has a background check verified by my attorney. And unlike you, she doesn't demand that I sell my home to pay off her debts." Mark stopped dead in his tracks. His face went pale. "What is that supposed to mean?" "It means I know why you were so eager to push me into that 2-day rotation schedule," I said quietly. "You needed me out of this house so you could pressure me to list it on the market. David told me you lost $15,000 in the stock market last month." Mark swallowed hard, his defensive demeanor crumbling into panic. "I was going to pay you back, Mom. Once the house sold, my share would have covered it, and I could have helped you out later. You were going to use my life's shelter to fix your financial mistakes," I said, feeling a deep, profound sadness. Not anger, just sadness. "And you wrapped it up in the lie of caring for my health." "I'm your son," Mark pleaded, stepping closer. "You're supposed to help your family. What good is this house if your own children are struggling?" "I have helped you, Mark," I said softly. "I helped you buy your first car. I helped with your wedding. I bailed David out. I supported Rachel. But helping you does not mean letting you destroy my dignity or leave me homeless." Clara quietly stood up and walked inside to give us privacy, closing the door gently behind her. "I spoke with Thomas last week." I continued pulling an envelope from my apron pocket and handing it to him. "My estate plan has been updated. This house has been placed in a living trust. It will remain mine until I pass. Upon my death, it will be sold, and the money will be divided equally into trust funds for my 4 grandchildren's college education." Mark stared at the official letterhead from Thomas's law firm. "You're cutting us out." "No," I replied firmly. "I am ensuring that the wealth your father and I worked 40 years to build goes to the next generation where it belongs. It won't be used to pay off credit cards, bad investments, or luxury cars. It will educate your children." "This is cruel, Mom," Mark whispered, his hands trembling. "You're punishing us." "Justice is not Cruelty, Mark, I answered. Cruelty was bringing me a schedule that allocated 2 days of my life to each of you and left me to figure out Sundays. Cruelty was treating your mother like a chore. Mark looked at the paper, then at me. For the first time in his adult life, he had nothing left to say. He turned around, walked down the steps, and drove away. 2 months passed. The tension didn't vanish overnight, but the dynamic fundamentally shifted. Realizing that emotional blackmail and legal threats would no longer work, my children had to make a choice: either accept me as an independent adult or walk away entirely. David was the first to reach out properly. He called on a Thursday evening not to ask for money, but to apologize. He admitted he had been selfish and promised to start attending gamblers' support groups. Rachel followed a few weeks later, bringing my grandchildren over for afternoon tea, though her tone remained somewhat distant. Mark needed more time, sending only brief text messages, but the door remained open. I didn't banish them from my life. I loved them too much for that. But I established clear, unwavering boundaries. I was their mother, not their bank account, and certainly not their dependent. On a bright, crisp autumn morning, I sat on my front porch with a hot mug of coffee. Clara was sitting across from me doing a crossword puzzle. The garden was thriving, filled with golden marigolds and red mums. It was Sunday. Under the old schedule my children had printed, today was the day I was supposed to be on my own, an outcast with nowhere to go, waiting for Monday morning so I could be shifted to another child's spare room. I looked around at my porch, my garden, my home. I was on my own. Yes. But I was not lonely. I was free. Living through that painful autumn taught me truths I wish I had understood 30 years earlier. As mothers, we often believe that unconditional love means unconditional surrender. We pour every ounce of our time, money, and soul into our children, believing that if we give them everything, they will automatically grow up to respect us. But respect isn't born from self-sacrifice. It is born from boundaries. When you teach people, even your own children, that your needs do not matter, you cannot be surprised when they eventually treat you as disposable. I made mistakes. I enabled their selfishness for decades by always stepping in to save them from their own failures. In trying to be a good mother, I had accidentally stripped them of accountability. And in doing so, I nearly stripped myself of my own dignity. Standing up to them wasn't an act of revenge. It was an act of necessary justice for them and for me. By refusing to let them schedule my life, I forced them to face their own responsibilities. And by protecting my home, I preserved my independence. Now, my blood pressure is stable. My home is peaceful. My children visit not out of obligation or financial interest, but because they know I am a whole person with a life of my own. No one gets to schedule your life for you unless you hand them the pen. I took my pen back, and for the first time in a very long time, I am writing my own story.
I looked through the peephole and my heart dropped straight to the floor. It had been 4 years, 3 months, and, if I'm being honest, somewhere around 11 days since my daughter had last spoken to me. Not a phone call. Not a text. Not even a card at Christmas. 4 years of silence so complete I'd started to wonder if I had imagined having a daughter at all. And there she was, standing on my porch, not alone. Her husband, my son-in-law, stood behind her with his hands in his pockets, looking at the floorboards the way men do when they've been dragged somewhere they'd rather not be. And behind him, I had to squint to make sure I was seeing right. There was a truck. One of those big orange U-Haul trucks, parked right in my driveway. 2 men in gray t-shirts were already opening the back of it. I stood at that door for a long moment. My hand was on the knob, but I couldn't make myself turn it. The cold feeling that started in my chest. I know that feeling. I've felt it before. It's the feeling that tells you something is very wrong and you already know it. You just haven't admitted it yet. I opened the door. My daughter smiled at me. That particular smile, the one that was always too wide to be entirely comfortable. "Mom," she said, "surprise. Let me go back." Because none of this makes sense without the beginning, and the beginning, if I'm honest, started long before that morning on my porch. My name is Rosemary. I'm 64 years old. I taught middle school English for 31 years. Same school, same hallways, same smell of cafeteria food and floor wax. Until the morning I handed in my resignation letter and walked out to my car and sat there in the parking lot crying for 20 minutes. Not because I was sad, but because I couldn't believe I had finally done it. That was 3 years ago. My husband Clive passed 6 years back. Heart attack. He was sitting in his recliner watching a baseball game and he was gone before the ambulance arrived. We had 37 years together, Clive and I. He was the kind of man who fixed things without being asked. The screen door, the leaky faucet, my bad moods, he just quietly fixed them. After he passed, my daughter, I'll call her by her name, Adrian. She was decent to me for about 8 months. Came by on Sundays, called every few days. And then she married Philip and something shifted, not all at once. Gradually, the way water changes color when a storm is coming. Philip is not a bad man, I don't think, but he's very much under Adrian's influence, and Adrian has always had very strong ideas about how things should be. The distance started with small things, missed calls that went unreturned for days, Sunday visits that got shorter and shorter until they stopped altogether. Then a dinner where Adrian told me, very calmly, over pasta that I had cooked, that I was too involved in their lives and that she needed space to build her own family without interference. I had not interfered with anything. I had offered to babysit my granddaughter, her daughter from a previous relationship, a little girl named, well, she was 7 years old, and she used to ask me to paint her nails, and Adrian had decided that was interference. That was the last dinner. After that, the call stopped completely. I sent birthday cards. I sent Christmas cards. I sent a card when they moved into their new house, and I found out about the address through my neighbor who had run into Adrian at the grocery store. That card came back unopened. I grieved that estrangement the way you grieve a death. There are stages. At first I was certain it was a misunderstanding, that any day the phone would ring and Adrian would say, "Let's talk." Then I was angry. Then I was just sad and quiet about it, the way you get when grief settles in and becomes part of the furniture of your life. And then I bought the lake house. The lake house was not extravagant. Let me say that clearly because people always assume. It was a modest 3-bedroom house on a small lake in East Tennessee, about 2 hours from where I've always lived. I found it through a listing that a former colleague shared with me. The price was reasonable, more than reasonable, honestly, because the couple selling it needed to move quickly due to a job relocation. I had savings from 31 years of teaching. I had Clive's life insurance. I had lived carefully and quietly for years, and I decided at 62 that I was allowed to do one good thing for myself. I bought the house and I did not tell anyone in my family, not because I was hiding it, but because after 4 years of being cut off, I simply had no one to tell. My sister knew. My friend Bea from the Teacher's Lounge, who I've known since 1987, she knew. That was the extent of it. I spent the first summer there painting the porch railing white and learning how to kayak, which is harder than it looks, and I fell in twice. I had a vegetable garden that produced approximately 7 tomatoes and a terrifying number of zucchini. I read every morning with coffee on the dock. I started sleeping through the night again for the first time since Clive died. It was the most peaceful I had felt in years. I should have known that peace doesn't last forever when you haven't secured the perimeter. The morning Adrian showed up, I had been at the lake house for a long weekend. I was planning to drive home the next day. I had just made a second pot of coffee and I was thinking about taking the kayak out before the weather turned. Then I heard tires on the gravel driveway. I looked out the kitchen window first. I didn't recognize the truck. Then I went to the front door and looked through the peephole, and there they were. I opened the door and Adrian smiled and said, "Surprise." And I stood there with my coffee mug, and I looked at the truck, and I looked at the 2 men unloading boxes, and I looked at my son-in-law who was still studying the porch floor, and I said, very quietly, "What is this?" Not a question. It didn't come out as a question. Adrian's smile held. "Philip got let go from his job last month. We've been struggling, Mom. We really have. And when we heard about the lake house." "How did you hear about the lake house?" A pause. The briefest pause. Cousin Eddie mentioned it at Aunt Bea's birthday. Don't be upset about that. My friend Bea. My neighbor Bea, not my Aunt Bay. There is no Aunt Bay. But Eddie. Yes, Eddie is my nephew, and yes, he had visited once that spring, and yes, apparently he had not kept his mouth shut. We thought, Adrian continued, that with 3 bedrooms, you'd have plenty of space, and we really need to get back on our feet. Philip is going to start job searching seriously. Stop. She stopped. The movers had a box halfway up the porch steps. I held up one hand in their direction without looking at them and said, "Please don't bring that up here yet." They stopped. They looked at each other and they stopped, which I appreciated. Then I looked at my daughter. 4 years. 4 years of silence and birthday cards returned unopened and a granddaughter I hadn't seen since she was 7. And now my daughter was standing on my porch explaining that she needed to move into my house because her husband had lost his job. I need you to understand something about that moment. I want to be very clear about this because I've thought about it many times since. There was a version of me, the version that existed for most of my adult life, who would have stepped back from that door, who would have said, "Come in, let's talk about this," who would have allowed the boxes inside while we figured things out because he's your family and she's your daughter and where else are they going to go? But I was 64 years old. I had buried my husband. I had grieved an estrangement for 4 years. I had bought a house with my own savings and painted the porch railing myself and learned to kayak and grown 7 tomatoes, and I had finally been sleeping through the night. And I had also, as it happened, changed the locks 3 weeks prior. Not because of Adrian, she'd never had a key to this house, but because the previous owners had given a spare to a neighbor who I didn't know, and my sister had suggested I get new locks put in, so I had. I said, "Adrian, I'm not going to let you move in here." The smile went somewhere. "Mom, you haven't spoken to me in 4 years. You sent back my Christmas cards. I haven't seen your daughter, my granddaughter, since she was 7 years old. You didn't call when I was in the hospital for my knee surgery. You didn't call when I retired. You showed up this morning with a moving truck without calling me first, without asking me, without any conversation at all. And you're surprised that I'm saying no." Philip, behind her, looked up from the porch floor for the first time. Adrian's voice changed. It got quieter and harder at the same time, the way voices do when someone is shifting strategies. "I can't believe you're going to turn your own daughter away. Philip lost his job. We have a child. I know you have a child. I would have liked to be part of her life. You decided otherwise. You were suffocating us. Adrian." I kept my voice level. This took more effort than I will pretend it didn't. I offered to babysit once. That was the extent of my suffocating. And even if I had been difficult, which I don't believe I was, 4 years without a word is not a response to a difficult mother-in-law. That is a choice. You made it. I respected it. Now I'm asking you to respect mine. One of the movers coughed. I think he was trying to signal something to the other one. Adrian tried several more things. She told me I was being cold. She told me I would regret this. She told me that Philip's mother had also offered them a room, and she had hoped I would step up first. I noted quietly that Philip's mother's offer might therefore be worth accepting. She told me I was punishing her for needing help. I said, "I'm not punishing you for anything. I'm simply telling you that you cannot move into my home without my permission. That is not punishment. That is a boundary." She said that word, boundary, like I had thrown something at her. "A boundary? Seriously. You sound like a therapist." "I've been seeing one," I said. "She's very good. I'd recommend it." Philip spoke for the first time. He said, Mrs. He stopped, recalibrated. "Rosemary, I'm sorry. I didn't know she hadn't called ahead." That landed differently than anything Adrian had said. I looked at him carefully. He looked genuinely embarrassed. Genuinely sorry, I thought, in the way that men look sorry when they realize they've been moved around a board like a chess piece without being told what game is being played. "I didn't know either," he said again. "I thought you knew we were coming." "I thought. She said you had talked." Adrian said, "Philip." He said, "What?" "She deserved to know we were coming." There was a long silence on my porch. The two movers were quietly having what appeared to be a private conversation down by the truck, and I didn't blame them at all. I said, "You two need to have a conversation that doesn't involve me. The movers need to pack back up. And Adrian, if you want to talk, really talk, I am willing, but not like this. Not with a truck in my driveway." I went back inside. I sat down at the kitchen table. My coffee was cold. I didn't care. I heard them on the porch for a while. Some of it was quiet, some of it was not quiet. After about 20 minutes, I heard the truck start up. I looked out the window and watched it back down the driveway. Adrian's car sat in the driveway for a while longer. Then it left too. I will not pretend that felt good. People seem to think these moments of standing firm feel triumphant, like the end of a movie where the music swells. It didn't feel like that. It felt like a lot of things at once. Sad, tired, a little bit shaky, the way you feel after something that required more courage than you knew you had, and something else that I couldn't quite name for a few days, something like clarity. I called my sister that evening. I told her what happened. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Good for you, Rosemary. I mean it." I called Bea. She said, "I'm so sorry. I didn't know Eddie would," and I told her it was fine, and I meant it. It was fine. I sat on the dock that night until it got dark. The lake was very still. There were frogs. There is something about frog sounds at night that I have always found comforting, which I realize is specific to me, but there it is. About 6 weeks later, Philip called me. He called from his cell phone on a Tuesday morning, and I almost didn't pick up because I didn't recognize the number at first. He introduced himself carefully, like someone who wasn't sure of his welcome, and I appreciated that. He told me that he and Adrian were staying with his mother, that he had found a new job, a good one, actually, better than the one he'd lost, that he was grateful for that. And then he said, "I think my wife owes you an apology. I think she knows that. I can't speak for her, but I wanted you to know that what happened, the truck, showing up like that was not something I would have agreed to if I'd understood what was actually going on. She told me you knew." I said, "I believe you." He said, I know this isn't my place, but I hope that someday you and Adrian can figure things out. For what it's worth, she talks about you more than she lets on. She's complicated." "She learned complicated from me," I said, "and from her father. We were both complicated people." He laughed a little at that, a quiet, cautious laugh. I asked about my granddaughter. Her name is Ruthie. She's 11 now. He said she was doing well in school, that she had become very interested in drawing, that she still asked about me sometimes. I sat with that for a long time after we hung up. Adrian called 2 months after that. She didn't apologize right away. It wasn't that kind of call, not at first. She called and said my name and then stopped, and I waited, and finally she said, "I don't know how to do this." I said, "I know, neither do I." We talked for almost 2 hours. I'm not going to detail all of it because some of it belongs to the two of us and no one else, but I'll tell you the part that mattered most to me. She said, "I convinced myself that you were the problem. It was easier. I was having a hard time in my marriage and I needed somewhere to put it," and she stopped. "I know that's not an excuse." "No," I said. "It's not. I know." "But it is an explanation," I said. "And I'm not entirely without fault either. I'm sure I pushed too hard sometimes. I was lonely after your father died. I probably leaned on you in ways that weren't fair." She was quiet. "I would like to know Ruthie," I said. "That's what I want most. If we can find our way back to something, I would like her to know her grandmother." Adrian said, "She wants that too. She asked for your phone number last week." I closed my eyes. "She's 11, I said. "She shouldn't have to ask." "I know, Mom. I'm telling this story because I think a lot of women my age know this particular kind of grief. The estrangement grief. The grief of a child who is still alive and choosing not to be in your life. People don't talk about it enough, and when they do, there's always this assumption that if your child pulled away, you must have done something terrible. Maybe. Sometimes. But sometimes you just have a complicated daughter who is working through her own damage, and you are the safest target, and you wait. What I wish someone had told me, you are allowed to protect yourself while you wait. You are allowed to buy a lake house and paint the porch railing and learn to kayak and sleep through the night. You are allowed to say no to a moving truck on your driveway. Protecting yourself is not the same as giving up on the relationship. The door and the heart can be two different things. I kept the door closed that morning. I'm glad I did. But I kept the other one open. And last Thanksgiving, Ruthie sat at my kitchen table and ate 2 pieces of pie and showed me her drawings. She's remarkably good, actually. Detail work that would have taken me 3 times as long at her age. And when she left, she hugged me for a long time without letting go. That's worth more than any moving truck could ever carry. If you're watching this and you're in the middle of something like what I went through, the silence, the waiting, the not knowing, I want you to know that it does not always end the way it ended for me. Sometimes it doesn't end well. I'm not going to pretend otherwise, but sometimes it does. And you deserve to have your lake house and your porch railing and your 7 tomatoes regardless of how it ends. You built that life. That belongs to you. Thank you so much for spending this time with me today. If this story felt familiar to you, drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from. I love knowing who's on the other side of the screen. And if you know someone who needed to hear something like this today, please share it with them. I'll see you in the next one. I've been thinking about cause and effect a lot lately, not in any grand philosophical way, just in the quiet, practical way you think about things when you're 64 and you've lived long enough to watch decisions play out to their conclusions. Adrian made choices, so did I. And what happened on that porch was not an accident or a stroke of bad luck. It was the entirely predictable result of years of accumulated decisions, hers and mine both. That's the part that took me a while to sit with. I wanted to see myself as purely the wronged party. And in many ways I was. But I also spent years absorbing treatment that wasn't right and saying nothing, keeping the peace, making myself smaller so that the relationship could limp along without an honest conversation. That was my choice, and it taught Adrian, without my meaning to, that I didn't have limits, that I would always be there regardless of how I was treated, that the door would always open. When you don't teach people how to treat you, they fill in the blank themselves. That's not cruelty on their part. It's just human nature. We all operate within whatever boundaries exist. When there are none, we expand. That morning with the moving truck was the logical endpoint of years of me not saying what I meant. What changed was not Adrian. What changed was me. I bought that lake house and I painted that porch railing and I sat on that dock, and somewhere in all that quiet I found the thing I had misplaced. The clear, unshakable knowledge that I was a person with a right to my own space, my own peace, my own life. That sounds simple. I promise it is not simple, especially when the person you're saying no to is your own child. There is a particular kind of guilt that comes with that. A voice that says good mothers don't turn their daughters away. I heard that voice. I let it speak. And then I closed the door anyway because I genuinely knew, that opening it would not help either of us. Protecting yourself is not the same as giving up on someone. That is the thing I most want to say to anyone watching this who is in the middle of something similar. Holding a boundary with someone you love is not an act of coldness. It can be if it's done with contempt or cruelty. But a quiet, steady no. A no that comes from self-respect and not from anger. That is one of the most honest things you can offer another person. It tells them the truth about where you stand. And the truth, even when it's hard, gives people something real to respond to. Ruthie drawing at my kitchen table last Thanksgiving, that did not happen despite the fact that I closed that door. It happened, at least in part, because I did. Because Adrian needed to see that I was a person she had to reckon with honestly. Not a resource she could return to whenever it was convenient. That realization took time. It required Philip's quiet decency and Adrian's own hard work, and probably more than a few difficult conversations I was not present for. Courage is not the absence of fear. I was afraid that morning. I was afraid of losing her permanently, afraid of being wrong, afraid of the look on her face. Courage is doing the thing anyway because you understand that the alternative, the slow erosion of yourself, costs far more. I still have the lake house. I still kayak badly. Last week I got 4 tomatoes, which is honestly a personal best. Some things are worth protecting.